Welcome back to 46 and Widowed Life, Love, and Family. I'm your host, Mr. Paul. Before I jump into this month's topic, I wanted to do a little housekeeping. I have finally gotten the podcast on several different programs now. Some of them took a little longer to get on than others. Big learning process for me. I've also started an Instagram, Facebook page, and an X, which is formerly Twitter account, so that I can interact with my followers more. So check those out, join or subscribe, and look for those in the description page of the podcast. And I would love to hear feedback from everyone. And if you would like me to clarify anything that I have talked about or spoken about, I will gladly respond. And who knows, you may give me a topic for future episodes. So look for those, the podcast main page. And also, you can use the comments in Spotify as well to leave any comments you would like. It'd be great to hear back from everybody. So during this brainstorming for this month episode, I wanted to focus on signs and fate in relations to my grief, but the one thing that kept coming up, and I didn't know whether to go this direction or not, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed that this is where it was going to go. So I will still talk about signs and things that have happened after her death, but the main thing I want to talk about is the why question. So we often ask the question why in the grief process, and for me, a lot of the why questions came during, after, and even now, today, I still ask a lot of why questions. So for beginning, for example, mine were like, why did Debbie get sick? Why did we not catch this ahead of time? Why did it not stay, or why didn't I stay longer at home that morning? Feeding into the different forms of guilt and trying to understand why all of this happened to us. And then, of course, why did she die even when things were getting better? And of course, the big question, too, is why would God take her from her son and me? And so the more I would think about it and the more I would go looking for this answer, like an onion, I just kept finding more and more pieces to add the why to. I got attached to every thought, every action, every memory I had. And I was trying to understand this part of this grief process. And when I looked at going back at the different stages, it seems like it was part of the bargaining stage, where we're bargaining with God or ourselves as to why is this happening? Take this away from us. Why are you putting us through this? Still asking that same question. And the main thing that I keep finding is that perhaps there is no answer to the why, at least not to every question, because when looking for the medical reasons, and I could find all those answers. They weren't the answers I wanted, but they gave me the truth that I may just have wanted to overlook or we didn't want to face. But I was able to find some whys, and then some of the ones that I know are more deeper emotional questions are ones that I may never have answers to. So during the early parts of the year, I started questioning. And some of the memories that came up seemed to play into this emotional side of me that was much darker, more, out in left field. And I was like, why are these thoughts the ones coming up now? And a lot of those thoughts led to the emotional part of asking why, because it just seemed odd that these memories seemed to fit the situation. So, as I said, part of me is very religious. I have my faith and what I believe in. And there's part of me, too, that also says, there has to be more than just what's around us. There is a spiritual world. There is a spiritual side to life. And that is where we're much more connected to everything, nature, to the world around us. It's not just black and white. There is this big gray area that we hardly focus on or talk about. And yet that's where these memories come in, these signs and situations that we question, like, are our loved ones still around us? Do they still see us? We can say, yes, we believe that they're up in heaven and that they're looking over us and they're guardian angels or they're angels watching over us. But then there's situations where we're like, are they actually still around us? Yes, they're at peace, they've moved on, but yet little things that show up, and we try to make sense out of those things. And one of the things, like, I always remember, when we talk about the cardinals, the red birds that are around, our first reaction is, oh, a loved one came to visit to say hello. Those are the kind of things I'm talking about, like on the spiritual side. Are they still around? Do they come and visit us? So what I decided to do this episode is to divide the two topics. So I decided I will talk about the why question and how I have tried to make sense of that. And then adding, of course, the signs and fate, or is it grief, on how we try to deal with the grief emotionally. So before I begin with the logical side, I would say that's the medical of the why questions. I just wanted to let y'all know that the information that I share, I've researched, so I will cite the sources in the description or add a file where I got that information. That's just my research, my school training, that you have to cite sources. But the other side, which is more the emotional side, the feelings, the experiences of feeling that Debbie's still around, signs that I feel might have given us an idea that this was the life we were going to live. That's all personal stuff, so there's nothing to cite there, just things that I believe, things that I've come to think about and put together as her still being around in spirit. So the second part may seem a little bit of a stretch or way out in left field, but this is just my opinions, things that I think about, things that my mind and my heart has come to realize, is this a possibility? So there's no real right or answer. It's just me sharing what I feel is going on at this point. So when I started looking up a logical answer to why Debbie got sick, I initially started when she had been in the hospital day one. I had already been looking up the sciatic issues, all the things that she had been complaining about. And then, of course, once we were told they had found the tumor, I started looking up that information. And every time another complication had come up, which she had several complications that needed to be addressed before we could actually get to the tumor and cancer. I was looking up, researching all those things, like, okay, what does that mean? Is there treatment for it? How is this relating to the cancer? And I went like that for months, just trying to figure out, where are we at? What are we going to do? And even while we had our hospital stay, there was at least 3 different times where I could have lost her to those other complications. So that sent me on another whirlwind of looking for answers and asking, why is this going on? How is it from one simple visit to the ER for a sciatic nerve lead to all these life-threatening complications? And I do have to thank the physicians that helped her during that time, because they were very hands-on. They knew what to do. They saved her each time. And it's dramatic having to recall those things sometimes, because it could have happened, she could have been gone months ago before she actually passed, over these little things that had become life-threatening. So while she was in the hospital during those times, the oncologist would come visit, the hematologist would come. She had a bunch of doctors just in and out all the time, checking on her, making sure she was fine. And every time the oncologist would come visit, she would ask him a bunch of questions about the cancer. But he would never answer the one question that she had, and that was which stage she was. And Debbie, being a nurse, she knew all the lingo, the medical lingo, and the nurses would come in and they would try to talk about what's going on, trying to think they were, what nurses do, they keep the medical lingo going so that they don't upset the patient. And at one point I just had to say, hey, she's a nurse, she understands what you're saying, so just be upfront and let her know, because she's going to read it anyways. And after that, the nurses would come in. They were not sugarcoating anything. They would tell Debbie, this is what's going on. And of course, Debbie, being the nurse, she was like, well, why don't we try this, or try to do it this way, and maybe this will help. And she was trying to teach them better processes to stuff that they had all done all their life. But that was just Debbie. She was always the teacher, even though she never wanted to teach. So we always found that funny. It's like every time there was a new nurse, it's like, okay, you're going to learn something new because she's going to teach you. Of course, Debbie always criticized afterwards, like, well, they could have done this better, or they could have done that, and look at the chords, and fix this and fix that, and she always had something to say. So again, when the oncologist would come, she would ask the same question and never get an answer. He'd kind of skirt around it. Of course, that's what she would tell me, because sometimes I was always missing the oncologist coming to visit, because he would come so early in the morning. And then during one of the visits, I think it was from the hospitalist, and she had gotten real close to him because he was very thorough, she liked him. And she just asked him, it's like, I keep asking this one question and I don't get answers, and can you answer it for me? And so he said, yeah. She asked him, he looked it up, and then that's when he told her that it was stage 4. And I think at that point, not only for Debbie, but for all of us, was, okay, well, what does that mean? This is now a real situation, because stage 4 is usually the highest or the worst of the stages. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, after that visit, that is when the oncologist came back, I think the next day or later that week, with that whole talk about hospice. And Debbie arguing that she was going to fight this, that she wasn't going to give up. She wasn't just going to go home and be comfortable. She was going to fight this for her son and for us and for everyone. So once we found out, okay, stage 4, being the person I am, I started looking up everything again now for the cervical cancer. What are the treatments for stage 4? How am I going to take care of her when we get home? What do I need to do? What do we need to have at home so that she's comfortable there between treatments? And I kind of went on my research, my manic state to, I have to figure out how I'm going to fix this. That whole mentality of the guy, the husband, I have to fix this. I can't let my wife go through this alone. I need to be there. I need to help and fix as much as I can on my side. And most of the time, Debbie was like, Paul, settle down. Stop reading so much. You're going to drive yourself crazy looking up all this information, and you're not going to like what it says, and I'm telling you now, just stop. And of course, I didn't, because husbands don't always listen to their wives, which makes me a side note now. And after everything I've read, I was like, husbands, listen to your wives. Because I should have listened to Debbie, because what I did find was a lot of stuff I didn't want to be real. Part of me already knew what I was going to find. Part of me already knew that time was limited, but I had to know for sure. I had to find the loophole, the way around this, that there wasn't one at all. So every medical article, medical website that I went to, and I was going to like the main ones, like the National Institute of Health, the cancer websites. So I was looking at the scholar articles. Again, research from school. You look for those that have been peer-reviewed and stuff like that. So I went looking, and of course I found some very general information on cervical cancer. Of course, it's one of the leading causes of cancer among women. It's linked to the exposure to the HPV, the human papillomavirus. And that's the one that was a couple years ago, pre-COVID, where they wanted all the teenagers to get vaccinated for it because they had noticed that it started to cause cancers, or at least certain strands of that virus was causing cancers. And of course, there was a lot of backlash on it. There was a lot of medical issue side effects that kind of deterred some people from doing it. But it's very common, and what they say is like everybody's bound to have at least some type of strand of it at some point in their life. Another thing I found was early detection through screenings, from their OBGYNs. And that was one question that we got quite a bit when Debbie was first diagnosed, if she had her normal screening. Debbie was very meticulous about her appointments because for the past couple of years we were trying to have a child. So she was seeing her OBGYN, and we saw fertility doctors, stuff like that. So she was pretty up to date on her annual exams, and there was never anything abnormal. So that was one question that kind of lingered in the background, is like, if it was always nothing abnormal on her test, then how is it all of a sudden here we are with dealing with her cancer? As I kept reading, I found the treatments that the doctor had already discussed, things that she was gonna go through physically. And again, I was trying to find that little glimmer of hope that the physician was wrong, or that she would get through this, that maybe they misdiagnosed the stage. And I think we were both in denial at the time. I think we would sit around, and we did sit around questioning, did the doctors read the right reports? Did they really test for everything? Are they really looking at her chart correctly? The labs reports done? Could we get a second opinion? But yet everything again pointed back to, yes, this is the reality that we're going through, and yes, she has been diagnosed with the stage 4 cancer. So again, I went deep diving again and started looking, okay, now that we know this is what's going on, what's the survival rate? How are we going to get through this? Going to fight it? Let's see what the articles talk about in survival. And of course, worst thing I could have done too, because what I found was just death every other word. And as I read, I would focus, and it said if with stage 4, this is when the cancer has already moved to different parts of the body, has caused different problems with different organs, which of course was the concern and what was going on with Debbie. That's why she had these other complications. And what I read was if it had spread to other parts of the body, the survival rate is only 19%. 19%, that is what we were working with, 19%. And not for a complete remission, but just 19% for her for the next 5 years. That is what we had to work with. In the next 5 years, she had a 19% chance of survival. Like, how do you deal with that? How do you focus on just 19? It became a number that I would just think over and over. And I said, but at least I would have her for 5 more years. But again, fooling myself, trying to think, okay, yeah, we can do this. We can beat this. And I believe Debbie knew the odds, and she wasn't going to go down without a fight. And that's what she did those 6 months, as she fought day in and day out until her body eventually just gave out. And of course, with every and most severe illnesses, it's never really the illness that kills you, but all the secondary issues that come with it, or some other illness that pops up along the way, is what ends up causing the death, not necessarily the cancer. So I had all this medical information, but it still didn't make complete sense to me, because cervical cancer, as I read too, just doesn't go from stage 1 to stage 4 overnight. Research says that it takes years to develop to stage 4, and that was always another thing that kind of lingered in the back of my mind, is like, how did it progress so fast? Especially again, having abnormal test. Not having an abnormal test, and all of a sudden having cancer. Not only, like I said, the doctors questioned, but we also started to question too. And it wasn't until I think I returned to work and I was speaking with the nurse about Debbie's diagnosis and how rapidly the cancer had progressed, and everything that we had gone through. And she had asked me if Debbie had ever gotten COVID-19, and I thought that's an odd question because I'm talking about cancer, and she was like, well, let me tell you what I've read. And she goes that there's been a lot of research out there starting to come out about COVID-19 and cancer. And when COVID first came out, me and Debbie did contract the COVID-19. It was right before vaccines were coming out. She had gotten sick. I had gotten sick. She had gotten the worst of it because she had been in the hospital for several days. I think it was like 9 days. She came out. She was on oxygen. She had one of the bad cases. And what this nurse was talking about was that these new studies were showing that there was looking for a connection between COVID and cancers, and females that were getting cancer. Of course, when I say this out loud or I talk about this, most people are like, oh, the vaccine, it must have been the vaccine. And I was like, well, no, because we hadn't been vaccinated at the time. This was right before that the hospital even started to mandate their vaccination policy. So we can't blame it on the vaccines. But what I did find out was that COVID didn't directly impact the cancer or cause the cancer. But the way they were curing COVID at the time, where they were hitting the immune system, to wipe out the virus to cure from this new pandemic, just sped up the progress of anyone that had any type of other illness, such as cancer. They were fighting the COVID. They ended up triggering the cancer because her immune system was shut down, so it progressed, and that's why, according to some new articles, is that it's not directly but indirectly affected people that now have cancer, dealing with cancer, and had COVID. So looking at that, with everything I read, it's like, okay, well, that's a possibility. That's a good logical answer, paper research driven. Okay, this is why she progressed so quickly. This is why she was dealing with all these complications. But again, that's just part of my mind trying to make sense of everything, and it's very black and white. However, the other part of me, I would say, I guess the hard part, the emotional part, didn't equate for anything. That did not make me feel better. That did not make me stop grieving. That didn't give me the answers that I always wanted, or the ones I wanted. It gave me a good basis for one. And yeah, I could move on and say, okay, this is what happened. She had COVID, it was complications, she got cancer, she died. That's an easy way out. But there has to be more to the why. So my searching didn't stop there. I had to find the why for my heart. And that had to deal with looking at past memories, looking at situations that, like I said, occurred after her death that still said that she was around. And even that led to the biggest why question I think I've had since her passing. And that was what happened that day. And I will share that at the end of the episode today as to what progress I've made on that. So let's go back to where I started with the emotional side. And mentally in my mind, I thought, okay, 19%, 5 years survival, not good enough, not what I wanted to hear. That equaled death, so I had to rely on my faith and God to say, how am I going to get through this, and how do I make sense of all this? And of course, we rely on our memories, good memories that we've had, memories that we lived in our life. And yet there within those memories, there were others that kind of seemed odd, as I said earlier, that kind of pointed to this situation, say, hey, did we know that time was limited? Did we have these signs or situations that now looking back play into was this the path we were on, and yet we chose either not to pay attention to those signs, or we just went past them as though nothing, thinking, we have 50 years together. So on the early part, I would pray, just I'm sure Miss Debbie would pray to take all this situation away from us. And I would question God why, after everything we've been through, after everything we're currently going through with our son, and why would this have been the next step? Why would he put us through this test or this trial to see if we could get through? And so there was times where I did get angry with God, and there was times that I would get angry at the situation because it wasn't what we wanted. It wasn't what I wanted us to be going through, and yet here we were going through the situation. So I think along with the bargaining part, there was the anger stage as well. And there's times that I still get angry at situations, sometimes at God, sometimes at Debbie, sometimes at myself, sometimes, it's just comes and goes as all the other stages come and go. But it's all part, I know, of the grieving process. So, again, I try not to direct that anger at anybody else. And I believe I've done a good job, but I'm sure I've been snappy at at points. But again, not intentional. It's just part of me trying to process all of that work that I'm going through now. So to tell and to try to find an answer for my heart, I said, let me look at all these memories that were coming up, all these odd experiences that we had throughout our 15 years, and why do they all kind of fit now together like a puzzle, saying, okay, hey, y'all's time was limited. I kind of told y'all, but y'all made the most out of it. But I've been kind of trying to tell y'all this since I've been trying to tell you this like early on, and y'all just didn't pay attention to it. So I'll share those memories with you, kind of talk you through those as to how they fit together. And to go along with this part of the podcast, I'm going to put a poll on Spotify after this, and it'll kind of relate to the end part of this episode. And just what do y'all think about that topic? And perhaps that can be another episode later on, or just kind of give me feedback on what we talked about today. So I used to believe that life was only based on chance, that we were born with free will, that what we chose is what life we had. We made that choice and how our life was going to play out. But I also think that partly now, some of it is planned out. Some of the ways we get through things, the way we get through life is kind of pre-planned. Whether that's through God, through fate, through just life in general, that we are able to read signs and make decisions based on certain situations, certain emotions, and that kind of leads us into the life that we live. And if we read those signs right, then we have the life that we've always wanted, or we have a good life. Sometimes we have a bad life, we read the wrong signs, but we have to understand what happened. So I said, like, the memories that came up after her passing, they were good memories at the time because we were together, we were sharing things. But looking back at them now, I'm like, were they as happy as we thought they were? Or were they those actual points in our life where something outside of us, something outside of, the normal world was telling us, hey, look at this, be prepared. And like I said, this can be far-fetched for some. This is just my thinking, my putting together of this puzzle. The first part I looked at, of course, was when we get married, we talk about, and we do our wedding vows, and we promise each other, better or worse, sickness and in health, till death do us part. And in that moment, of course, are we really thinking about the till death do us part vow? Because we're having a good time. It's a happy occasion. We're finally getting married. things we've planned for, things that we've been wanting, we don't stop and think about, okay, someday we're going to have to deal with the death of our spouse. So I think in general, we kind of till death do us part is thrown towards the side at the end of those vows, even though it is something that we will have to go through. And then outside of that, have these signs that we call, or we try to say, are like visits from our loved ones after they pass. I talked about the cardinal. We sometimes find a random feather in an odd place, and we say our loved one was visiting. We find a random penny, another they were visiting, and we use that, I believe, to help cope with the loss, to help us feel connected with them. But is it a possibility that, yeah, they are there, that they are making these visits? Sometimes we dream of them, we hear their voices, in the house, a song plays and it reminds us of them, or we can feel them around. And I remember that afternoon when she died, was forced to take a nap because I was emotionally drained before my son came home. And I remember laying there, and of course I was crying, I was slowly falling asleep, and then all of a sudden I felt like an arm around me, and of course it was just me in the room. And I said, well, was that her? She was there trying to comfort me. And of course I would question, is it real, or was it just something that my mind had projected to make me feel as though I wasn't alone at that time? I like to think that, yes, it was her, that she had come to say, I'm sorry I left, I'm sorry this happened, that she was there at least one last time. And then I remember falling asleep. So those type of situations. And, even when my son was younger and he still couldn't talk, he wasn't talking yet, but he would be in his room playing, and he would just be laughing by himself and, talking as though he was talking to somebody. And of course my thought was, okay, well, mom's there, he's talking to mama, mom is here to visit and stuff like that. And then I remember at one point, and I think it was up to the year, he was doing that same thing. He was playing and he was talking, and then all of a sudden he started crying, but not the just regular crying. He was like wailing as though he was hurting. And all I remember is him saying, no bye-bye, no bye-bye. And I thought, well, is she finally having to leave and not be able to play with him or interact with him anymore? And that was hard to watch. And yet I felt those were the thoughts that came in my head. It was like, okay, is she leaving? Is she having to go now? And then shortly after that, my son was just talking nonstop. I don't know if was, again, something real, or is it something I make up, or something my head tries to tell me to help my heart, or what. I'm not sure what it is. But situations like that would continue to happen all the time. So when I went back and started having all these memories and all these situations that kind of pieced together, it started way back even before we were married. It was when we were still dating. And one of the things was that we were big texters. We always left messages for each other. Back then, I think we both had one of those Motorola razors, that kick-sided with the keyboard. I think that's what they were called. And anyways, so when we weren't together, we were always texting messages to each other, leaving messages like, hey, have a good day, see you tonight. Are we going to go out? Love you. Leaving those type of messages. And then even after we got married, it still continued, except now we weren't using the phones. We were leaving notes around the house, hiding them for them later. So like when I would go to class, I was going through my master's program at the time. So I would go to class, or I'd go to conferences for school and work. I would always find a note that she had written on a Post-it or a sheet of paper mixed in with my presentation notes or in my bag, just to let me know that she loved me and she missed me, and she said have a good time, giving me encouragement for the presentation, like you got this. And one of the notes I still use as a bookmarker from one of the first times that she did that. And then, of course, in return, I would leave notes around the house while I was gone. Like, I knew by the pillow, where she was going to be that day, by the sofa, just little love notes saying, I miss you, wish I was there, I'll be home soon. And it worked for us. And yeah, it sounds cheesy, but cheesy works. It was effective. We would always do this. So when Debbie died, I spent those first few weeks searching the room, the house, her bags, for a message. I said, she couldn't have left without telling me something. Think that wasn't our situation. And for days, I couldn't find anything. And I would tell everybody, like, I know she would have left me something. She would have written something down, at least a goodbye note. I love you, something, and nothing. And I would get so frustrated. And then I was reading one night just to kind of clear my head from everything, and I came across a passage that talked about how we always want a sign from our lost loved ones. They're alright if they crossed over. And it says, stop looking for it, because you won't find it. You're gonna miss it. Have to allow the message to find you. And of course I knew somewhat of that. It's a simple concept. It's like putting it in God's hands. If God wants you to have it, then he'll let you have it, or he'll lead you the right way. I went ahead and said, okay, part of me said I can let it go, and when it finds me, it finds me. But yet I would still look around the house. I would still go through stuff just because, I knew she had to have left me something. And yet I would get so frustrated and disappointed most nights because I would never find anything. So the next memory would be after we had been engaged. We would go to San Antonio for the weekends. We'd go visit friends. We'd go out. We'd go to dinner, movie, and then head back home to start the week with work. And one of the trips, we went to go see P.S. I Love You. And she had read the book and she wanted to see the movie. And of course, it was her day to choose the movie. So that's the one we went to see. And after the movie, we sat there in the car in silence, and I noticed that she was trying not to rub her eyes, and I thought, is she crying? And Debbie did not cry often, and if she did, it was for something big. You either did something big or you really made her upset. And I kept looking at her, and I was like, yeah, she's crying. And I made a joke, and she saw that. Then I saw when she had the tears in her eyes, and I was like fighting back my own, because I was like, okay, my goodness, what did I do? What did I say? And then for some reason I started tearing up, and of course she laughed, and we laughed, and she was like, why are you crying? And I think at the same time we said, because of the movie. And of course we laughed again, and she made fun of me, like, oh, you're so emotional, you're always crying about everything, big teddy bear. And I thought, no, it's like this movie kind of opened this whole dialogue of the future. Yeah, we were engaged, we were going to get married, but then I know that someday I was going to have to lose her. And that's what I told her. It's like, I realized that yes, we love each other and we're going to have this life together, but someday I'm going to have to lose you. And I don't think I'd be able to handle it alone. And I think that's maybe where we got the whole leave a note type, kind of validated what we were already doing. And maybe that's why I kept looking for a note later on. Because she would also say, she would laugh and says, don't worry, I'll leave you instructions. I will leave you plenty of instructions as to what to do. So maybe that's what I was looking for. I was looking for these instructions now that she had gone, as to how was I supposed to move on with my life. Looking back now, of course, they weren't written down. She told me, and of course I listened to most of them. But I was still looking for something written. So the memory that came up after that was after we had gotten married. And it was a conversation that I had with some people on our honeymoon. So we had the big Hispanic wedding. It lasted like 4 days. We started on Thursday and it went all the way till Monday. Big party. And that Monday we left on our honeymoon to Hawaii. That's where she wanted to go. I wanted to go. Never been. So that's where we went, and of course we stayed at the hotel she wanted. It was out on the North Shore at Turtle Bay, and it was a wonderful time. You know, it was exactly what we wanted, a getaway, low key. Everything was slow paced. We took our time, sightseeing. You know, it was one of the best weeks we've had. And one of the last nights, the hotel out there had a luau for like honeymooners and those that were celebrating their anniversaries. So we signed up for it. And that night we sat at the table with two other couples. And as of course we had made conversation throughout the night with them, and there was a young couple that was on their honeymoon too, and then an older couple that was celebrating their anniversary. The young couple were from Sweden, I believe. They had spoken about how they had been on a month-long honeymoon visiting the U.S. So they were going all over coast to coast to on their honeymoon. And then the older couple, I don't remember where they were from, but I was speaking to the gentleman and I told him that Debbie and I were on our honeymoon. And he said, you're getting this trip out of the way early. He goes, Hawaii is usually a trip you take later in marriage. Like, it's taken us 50 years to get here. And I remember mentioning something along the lines of like, yeah, well, you know, you never know. You know, it was a possibility that we could come, and we made it happen. But again, you never know with time. You know, so yeah, we got it out of the way early. You know, and of course that comes back to us like, okay, again, we were jumping ahead of, you know, normal schedule of everybody else. You know, and we were already taking the Hawaii vacation. And then we returned home and we had our life together. And then came the movie Up from Pixar. By this time, Debbie and I had already been having difficulty with getting pregnant. And of course, the whole first 10 minutes of that movie, you know, had everybody crying. And we would later joke and compare our lives together to that of Ellie and Carl. Because we saw ourselves in them. You know, and, you know, I saw myself as, again, validating what I had thought back in the movie is that, yeah, I'm going to have to live life without her someday. And am I going to be that grumpy old man? Hopefully not. So we would focus, not on that, but we would focus like, okay, well, you know, they weren't able to have kids, but they made the most out of life. You know, they would go on adventures, they would go on trips, and that's what we did ourselves. We would make our own adventures and we would take off. You know, luckily we were able to do that with our lives, and every chance we got, especially around our anniversaries, we were off somewhere. And I remember our cousins telling us one time that she was always following us on Facebook to see where we were off to or what adventure we were on or getting into, because we would always document that, you know, here we are today, you know, this is what we're doing. And this eventually led us to using the quote, you will always be my greatest adventure, to each other. And I ended up putting that quote on our tombstone, you know, to just validate that, yeah, she was my greatest adventure. So again, all these things were kind of connecting in its weird way, and we didn't even know that they were connecting. So then throughout the years, whenever the topic of death would come up after funerals or knowing someone that has passed, we would discuss what we wanted, as I had already mentioned, and we would joke around. And like I said, Debbie would say, I would leave you instructions. She would say, if I die before you, you have to become a deacon. And it says that way you can't get remarried, because she didn't want another woman living in her house. And we would laugh, and I would say, no, believe me, I will not remarry. Being married to you was enough. And I'd joke about it, and I said, I don't have enough energy to go through all this again. She would laugh, and I would laugh, and we'd just play it off. And then, I guess it was 3 months ago, the next memory came up. And this had to do with me being manic, I think. I was frustrated, and I felt the need to clean, so I figured I would start cleaning out some of her clothes. So I said, I'll start with the dresser, you know, and then the dresser drawer underneath the bed, you know, and just get rid of things that needed to get rid of, and then pack away what needed to be packed. And as I was doing this, I came across a lot of old t-shirts. Since we would go on different trips and stuff, that we would always get a t-shirt or something from those trips relating to it. So for one anniversary, when we went to Fredericksburg, we went grape stomping, and we had those shirts. So those shirts I kept, the things that were sentimental. But one of the shirts that I came across was the last time we went to Disney World. So the last time we had gone, we had seen couples walking around all week with the shirts from Up. They had the saying, they had the house and the thing, and of course it was a couple shirt. So the wife's shirt had Carl's name. I think the guy's shirt had Ellie's name. Like, she's my Ellie, he's my Carl. And we would look for them, and we'd look for them everywhere, and nobody knew where they were at. And we talked to the workers at the shops, and they had no idea what we were talking about. But yet we would see these shirts all over the parks. And then I think one night we just finally asked somebody, it's like, where did you find that shirt? And they told us, yeah, there's a little kiosk at Animal Kingdom that has them. And they kind of told us where. The next day, that's the park we were going to. So we planned that day. That was our mission, to go find those shirts. And of course, we didn't find them until right at the end of the night. And then they also had bottle cap pins of both of Carl and Ellie's face. So we bought those too, and then we figured we'd wear those with the t-shirts. So the last night of all our Disney World trips, the family we had gone several years, and we have always gone with the family. So the last night, the family gets together at Magic Kingdom to watch the fireworks one more time, and then take family pictures before we leave the next day. So that year, the trip had been a little different. Things were a little off. Things didn't feel right. Just my sixth sense was like really high, and by the nighttime, it was hitting like 100%, and I was feeling emotional. I was feeling nauseated. I was like, something's wrong. And I usually get this way when my intuition or sixth sense is kind of out of whack. But I would always get these strange feelings. And we were there that night, and everybody was doing last minute shopping before the fireworks. And I remember being in the store looking for something and feeling very claustrophobic. It was just nauseated, and just my head was hurting, and my gut was hurting, and I had to get out of the store. So I remember telling Debbie I was going to step out for some air, and she pretty much knows when that was going on with me, because she'd be like, settle down, Paul, just go for a walk. And I remember standing outside by the shop, and I was by myself, and the nausea was just too much, and like, I need to get something to drink. And I remember looking around, and I saw my dad. And he was just a few feet in front of me. I don't even think he knew I was there. And he was in the crowd looking over at the castle with a smile on his face. And I thought, what a perfect memory. He's worked hard all his life and to bring the family on vacation and spend time with them, not just once, but this was already like 4 times that we've come to Disney with the family. What a perfect memory to end this week with. And then slowly everybody started pouring out of the store and getting ready for the pictures or to watch the fireworks. And then we watched fireworks, and then we took some pictures and stuff like that. And I think Disney World can be very emotional. I think they set it up that way, or mess with their senses to be emotional. But mine were like sky high at this time, and we were trying to take pictures, and all of a sudden I got very, weepy. I was trying not to cry because I didn't want to mess up pictures. And in most of the pictures I'm in the background, like trying to hide, from crying. And all of a sudden, we're shooting the picture of the whole family, and this one thought like goes through my head, and I'm like, I kind of shocked myself, and the thought was, this is the last time we'll all be together. And then that thought just kept getting louder and louder, picture after picture, it just kept getting louder and louder, and I'm like trying to tell myself to stop, and I couldn't just walk away for a little bit to clear my head because we were taking pictures. I did my best to smile, and I was like, I hate when this starts with me, because it takes a while to end, or I need to figure it out. And that was the memory that came when I saw these t-shirts. And looking back, there could have been a million different reasons that was going to be the last time all of us would be together. But it never did tell me that it would be because Debbie would be gone. And I think now it's like, I think back, was that my call? Was that this what I was being told? And of course, again, this type of outside external forces, whatever it is you want to believe it is, come and go. I mean, it's not true. It's just the thought that comes across. So hard to explain, but whether it's intuition, sixth sense, we believe what it is. But for me, putting in this puzzle together, yeah, it made sense that we weren't going to be together. This was the last picture we were going to have at Disney World together. Now if we go, which we haven't gone since, she won't be in the picture, but our son will. So I'm sure that will make a whole episode in itself. Because I always say how emotional it's going to be to go there without her. So one of the last things that kind of, I guess, I put together was when she was sick and we were going to treatment, and she was getting ready to finish. Things were looking good. She was getting better. The tumor had shrunk. We were taking it day by day as best we could, and I would tell her that she had to ring the bell that last time, and of course she would always tell me like, no, she's not going to ring the bell, she's not going to ring it. And I said, yes you are, I'm going to ring it for you, you have to ring the bell. And she would say no, and maybe again that was just part of her knowing that she wasn't going to make it that far, because again, we had missed that last treatment. She was one treatment short, and before she passed. So that was kind of the last piece that went into this puzzle I was trying to connect. And after she died, again, like I said, I was looking for those notes, and I would still go looking, and I would look through her bags that she would take to treatment. I remember going through her vehicle, her Bible, anything I could find, and I would still find nothing. And so each month, I remember, especially for the first year, on the 10th on Facebook, I would post something about her, a memory, and then I would attach a song. And at first it was songs that, were about us, that we liked. But then I started to notice that as I would go looking for songs for each month, I was finding songs that, one, I had never heard before, one we had never shared, but yet spoke about us, or part of our life together, or the current situation. And I remember also noticing that around that time, every 8th of the month, I would start to get down and start to miss her more and get very emotional, post a lot of things about our lives together. So I'm guessing that may have been some of the depression stage, and then leading up to the 10th, where I would post the song and the monthly memory, and then I would be fine. And what I found odd was that some of these songs were like from the 80s, from the 70s and 90s that I would have heard of before, but I never heard them. I knew the artist, but I had never heard that specific song. So again, it seemed odd that these were the songs that were coming up. Like she somehow knew what song to let me know or to let me hear so that I could post it in honor of her. Another thing that I did, and I believe it was around the summer, I had her cell phone and I had left it on because I was still getting calls from like the insurances and stuff like that, and I finally found out I could transfer the phone calls to my cell phone, and then I turned off her phone because she was always getting Facebook notifications, people missing her, people posting stuff. I would post messages to her saying I missed her. Her sister and brother would do the same thing, And I said, I'm just going to turn it off. That way, if they do it, I'm not having to hear it. It's an easy way around having to deal with that emotional side of her phone going off. And I had done that for a while, and as I was looking for those messages that I was wanting, I came across her phone several times, and I kind of just put it to the side, and never thinking that I should turn it on and look at the phone. Until one night, that's what I did, and it's like, okay, I can't find it anywhere else. The message must be on her phone. I remember turning it back on, and I said, okay, where would she have left me a message? Because it would have been text message, because I would have gotten it. And I was like, the notes. It has to be in the notes section, or the notes app. So I clicked on that, and of course she had tons of notes. She would document everything. And I was scrolling through it, like halfway down, it just had a date, and it just happened to be the time that she was in the hospital. So I clicked on it, and she had kept a diary of that month while she was in the hospital. Talked about the complications, the times that she could have passed from those complications, the talk of the hospice, the talk about treatment. She talked about how she was feeling, how scared she was, and then at the end of that diary was the message. 2 simple sentences, and I'm not sure how many times I read those over and over that night. Luckily my son was asleep when I did that, and I think I cried myself to sleep that night, knowing that I had finally found what I was looking for. And since then, I've dreamt about her twice. Sadly, both times I wake up and I cannot remember what we spoke about. I know she was healthy, she was happy. I know she told me a bunch of stuff, but I can't remember, and that's not like me, because my dreams have always been very vivid and very detailed, and I can wake up and I would remember telling her, this is a dream I had last night, and she goes, that's a bit much, Paul, like, how do you remember all that? And then other people would tell me they would dream about her too, and they would talk, and sometimes they would remember some stuff, and sometimes I think they just wouldn't tell me what they talked about, and sometimes I would be like, she's talking to you, but she doesn't come to me, like I can't remember anything she says. But I guess, again, in time, maybe I will eventually get to that point where I will remember. And again, I think it was after the year of her passing, I remember going through TikTok and just randomly scrolling that night, and there was a video that started with the person you loved has a message for you. And I'm like, well, that's odd. And I think it said, like, the person that you love that's passed or something has a message for you. And I scrolled back down to listen to it, and the person on it started talking, and it was like to a T about what had happened, about Debbie's passing. It was like, I'm sorry that I had left, I didn't mean to, but you knew I was sick and my body was just giving out and I couldn't take that anymore, and it's like my body just gave up. All these things that I had already told myself about her passing. This little video randomly repeated the same thing. Okay, how is that possible? Is it just chance, or is it just one of those odd situations? And I guess, of course, I cried. I'm always emotional now. It didn't take much. I remember I saved it, and then I went back looking for it a couple of weeks later, and I guess I didn't save it right, or the person took it down, but I've yet to find it again. Again, it validated part of what I had already told myself. And then there, like I said, the other times is my son has mentioned things that, make me think that she's still around. When, like I said, when he was little, he would be talking and laughing and like as though she was there. And then, of course, the situation where he cried that she was leaving. And then recent, I was weaning him off of his pacifier. And he had been so frustrated and irritated by that. He was having withdrawals and everything bothered him. It was a very rough week doing that. And then I remember one night him getting mad, like in the middle of the night, out of nowhere. And he woke up like at 3 in the morning just crying and mad that he wanted his pacifier, which he would call his mon. And he cried so much, and like he cried for like a good 20 minutes. I felt so bad because I was trying to break it from him, so I wouldn't give him the pacifier. And the more he said mon, it sounded like mom, and that kind of like a stab in the heart. It's like, oh, he's crying for his mom now, but he was actually saying for his mom, for his pacifier. And then, of course, he fell asleep in my arms. And then I remember getting mad at Debbie and saying, look, this is what you're missing. You should be here. Like, this is the hard stuff that we're going through, and yet it would be so much nicer if you were here to help. And I think that's just part of the cycle that the anger comes up too, especially when I think of her, is that you're missing out on this. These are the little things that you should be here for, to help out, to be part of your son's life, to help him make these memories. And I get so mad sometimes that she isn't here for those things. And then I get sad because she's not here for those things. So it's always a back and forth. So that night that happened, the next morning, of course, he struggled to get up because he was up in the middle of the night. And we were heading out, and I remember I was putting my son in the car seat and said, we're running late again, let's get going. And when I was putting him in the car seat, our car seat kind of twirls around, so it's easier to get him in. And as I was getting him in there, he kept looking past me and like staring, like hard staring. And I was like, what is this boy looking at? Somebody's behind me or what? And I asked him, and I said, what is it? He just smiles, and he's like, Mama. And I'm like, okay. And he just kept pointing. He's like, Mama, Mama. And I like turn around, and sitting on the sign that I have hanging on the door was this beautiful female cardinal. Now, the female cardinals, if you don't know, they're the brown and yellow orange color. And there was this huge, beautiful one sitting there. And I remember him saying, look, Dada, look. And all of a sudden, the bird started singing. And always when I would do this with him, I say, hi, Mama. Hi, thank you for visiting. And, of course, the birds flew away. And I was like, what is the, again, possibility of this all happening at this point? And even today, I see the cardinals, or either the red cardinals or the female cardinals, and I'm always, she's visiting, she's come to say hi, to check in on us. And when I think about all the people that I know who have lost their spouses, or the stories that they've lived through love, especially that of my parental grandparents, I never once doubted or wondered if they would ever do this all over again. Even knowing the heartache and knowing what awaited them, would they still fall in love? And I would say yes, I would. It was, like I said, it was a great 15 years. There's nothing I can complain about or say that we didn't do. Going back to that question, why, sadly there is still questions. And again, one of the biggest questions that I still carry, and to find that answer would probably lead me into more, rabbit holes than anything, is to what happened that day. What happened those 30 minutes that she was by herself? There are certain things that I can remember from that day after I got home, after I knew she'd passed, that I haven't shared with anyone. I've kept that to myself. But I still question, what happened. And, rabbit holes are rabbit holes. And again, I was on TikTok. and I went down a rabbit hole one day, and I asked a specific question. They were doing, there's always tarot readers, psychics, mediums that are on there. They do live feeds, and of course, I was listening to one, and I had talked to a friend about it too. She had gone to go see the Long Island medium at some point, and I've talked to my sister-in-law. We've talked about going about mediums and stuff like that, and we're like, no, I don't think I want to know any of that stuff. But yet that day, I jumped into the rabbit hole and decided to ask one of them a question, and of course, the response I got validated what I've always thought about that day. And I said, well, that's okay. That's one person. How truthful are these? There's a 50-50 chance for the answer, yes or no. So I scrolled to another one and I asked the same question and I got the same answer. And I said, okay, there's two. Let's try one more. So I scrolled to another one and waited. And the fact that I was getting answers to the question was just odd in itself because there's so many people on there. And the third one, I asked the same question, and I didn't get the yes or no answer. I got, you need to book a reading. So obviously by this time it was like, okay, you know the answer, so if you want to talk about it, let's talk about it. Of course I didn't. I still yet to go down that rabbit hole. But basically 3 people told me the same answer. The 3 different people from around the world. And so have I always known what happened? Or my inkling of what happened that day true? That is what I've been going with, and it's upsetting because it shouldn't have happened, or maybe we could have avoided it happening, or again, it could have happened and been a worse situation than it was. But either way, it did occur. That was, I guess, the plan. That's how God's plan, life's plan, fate's plan, that's what's supposed to happen. But I still question, and I think even if I went to look for that answer, I would still get the same answer. So I guess that would be the poll question for this episode. Do you believe in mediums? Do mediums have access to that spiritual world that can talk to our loved ones? Yes or no? So look for that later on at the end of this episode to be posted. And we'll see what people have to say. It'll be interesting. So again, part of me believes, yes, Debbie is still around. She still sees us. She still sees what we do. She's still part of our life. She's just not here physically, which is difficult. And as I always said, the hardest part too is knowing that she's missing out on our son's life. Again, she should be here to hug him when he cries, laugh when he acts silly. And if any of y'all have met him, that smile of his, especially when he's being mischievous, you tell him not to do something and he just smiles at you and does it. It's those little things that I feel that she's missing out on. And those are the ones that still get to me. I guess that's the end of this month's episode. Again, look for the poll. So next month, I will discuss the biggest struggle that me and Debbie had in our marriage, which surprisingly I found that more people struggle with fertility issues than I thought. And I'll share how we cope with the situation, how we relied on our faith, and we eventually left it in God's hands. And our son came into our lives at the time we both needed him. So next month will be his episode. So thank you for listening to 46 and Widowed, Life, Love, and Family. I'm your host, Mr. Paul, and you can catch my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Pandora, and now on YouTube. Also, don't forget to follow me on Facebook, 46 and Widowed, Life, Love, and Family, on Instagram at 46 and Widowed, and on X, formerly known as Twitter, at 46 and Widowed. You can find those links in the bio. Leave a message, comment, something that you would like me to cover or have more information on. Again, don't forget to take the poll. after the episode. Again, thank you for listening, and God bless.